So Kierkegaard. So I'm going to talk about three things to introduce this philosopher to you. Number one, we'll talk about the movement of existentialism, of which he's a part. Then number two, we'll talk about his biography. And number three, we'll talk about his works, his three books. There are three books we're going to look at, just talk about. Number one is the Journal of the Seducer. Number two is Either Or. And number three is the book that we have, which is Works of Love. Okay, so that's the plan for today. Okay, so let's begin first with introducing existentialism, which is the movement that he's a part of. It's the movement that he's also pioneering along with Nietzsche, right? Both him and Nietzsche can be considered the fathers of existentialism. And then came the rest, right? People like Jean-Paul Sartre, people like, Marcel, whom I think are we studying Marcel? No, not in this class. Okay, so, but Irigaray, who we're going to study, is going to mention Jean-Paul Sartre, who is one of the important figures of existentialism. So let's talk a little bit about existentialism, what existentialism is reacting to, what are they criticizing, and then we'll be able to better situate Kierkegaard. So existentialism is really a backlash against what we call modernity. And modernity we studied with Kant, right? So we know a little bit of the mindset of the moderns, right? And so we're going to review that briefly, and then we're going to see how Kierkegaard and all the existentialists are going to move away from this mindset. So can anyone remind me, for Kant, what were the two parts of our makeup as human beings?
Pathological and practical.
That's the two ways that we love, but I'm talking about the two things, the two forces that inhabit us.
Reason and instinct.
Yes, exactly, right? So we have two parts, reason, instinct. Instinct is connected to our desires, our our desire for happiness, right? Our desire for well-being, and then reason, you have to rise above, right? Your this instinctual part of ourselves, right? So which part is superior for Kant?
Reason.
Exactly, right? And reason takes us beyond our instinct, right? According to Kant, we are supposed to be more than our instinct. We're supposed to be more than all of these desires for happiness, this whole longing for happiness that we have, which manifests in many different ways, right? We want security, we want love, we want money, we want wealth, we want safety. All of these desires, right, which are instinctual, which have to do with our well-being, with our happiness. According to Kant, this whole dimension of our lives is not important. It's important, but there's a higher version of ourselves which rises above, which goes against, and which is not connected to our comfort and well-being, and this part is reason, right? So you can see that there's a kind of what do you call that, split personality right, that arises with someone like Kant, and he probably was himself a little bit split, right? So so let me summarize. So modernity is very much embodied by Kant, right? Modernity says everything that pertains to the body, to the material realm, is not important. It's low part of ourselves. And we saw this also with Plato, by the way, right? Remember the higher love, the lower love. Kant is just a rerun of Plato, right? When Plato says the material part of ourselves is the corrupt part, it's the cave, we have to rise above for, the ideal. Kant says the same thing. The instinctual part is the low animal part. We have to rise above with reason, right? So modernity is really starting even with Plato, right? But exacerbates with someone like Kant. And modernity basically says there are two parts of our being. There's the material and there's the rational. And what matters is the rational. The rational should be our guide, and the material part doesn't matter. That's the main issue with modernity, right? Modernity can be summarized in one sentence. Let me write it down, right? Modernity is simply the domination of instinct by reason. or the domination of matter by spirit. Okay, this is in a nutshell the mindset, the worldview of modernity. Domination of the material by the spirit, of the instinct by the reason, and we constantly have to dissociate from that part of ourselves in order to better dominate it. Okay, so that's a very important definition. Make sure you write it down. Now, existentialism is going to be the backlash. Existentialism is going to say, why are we constantly bashing this part of our humanity? The instinctual, the material, the body. Why is this always low and corrupt and we shouldn't animal, right? Animalistic. Why are we giving these labels, right? Why are we always saying that the material and the instinctual and we call it animalistic? Why are we saying that this is low and then reason is high, right? And so existentialism is saying what we want to do is go back to that part which has been neglected. And so one of the main contributions of existentialism, right, is to say we need to embrace our humanity, our bodies, our instincts, our materiality, and we need to make that the subject of exploration and find beauty and meaning in that part of ourselves. And that's what we want to explore. That's in a nutshell existentialism. Okay, let me get you in a second, Lo. Let me just summarize existentialism, right? Existentialism, therefore, right, is the backlash. It says it is really the attempt to explore philosophically the neglected, right, dimension of matter, instinct, the body, etc., right? So that's what, so they're turning their gaze, right? All the philosophers until then, from Plato to Kant, were saying, we need to look, we need to leave the cave, we need to look up, right, to our rational, idealistic part. And existentialists say, no, we're going to look down now. We're going to go back to the body, go back to the instinct, go back to matter, and we're going to explore that dimension of our life. We're not just going to always try to leave it behind. Okay, Lo, go ahead.
My question was answered. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Right, so you have someone like Nietzsche, for example, just to give you a quick, he's one of the main ones, right? He's going to say, yeah, let's, so he's making a criticism of Western thought, always saying that our emotions don't matter. What matters is our thoughts, right? So we have this mentality in Western thought. What matters is our thinking. Our emotions are always, you know, we cannot trust them. They're murky, they're confused. And Nietzsche is going to say, I'm tired of hearing this, right? I believe that our emotions also have something positive to say. They are also speaking a kind of truth, right? So Nietzsche is somebody who wants to go back to the emotions, the passions, explore those, and not only the thoughts, right? Okay. So yes, thank you, Dali, for that question, right? Where does nihilism fall into the spectrum? So this is one of the most, in my view, serious misconceptions of existentialism, right? Because, so let me explain where it comes from, right? This is the accusation that Dali is talking about, that existentialism is nihilistic, right? Meaning it's always bleak, it's always talking about how wretched we are, and, you know, it's all smoke a cigarette and die, right? That's the image, right, that people get from existentialism. So this is, where is this coming from? So I'll explain. As soon as you start to talk about our humanity, right, our bodies, our materiality, you're going to also talk about our pain, our anxiety, our death, but also our pleasure, our love, and so forth, right? So existentialism is exploring all the dimensions of our materiality. So all the dimensions of what makes us human, right? So this, of course, will bring us to the beautiful side, which is the exploration of pleasure, the exploration of love, the exploration of our passions, right? But then you have the other side, the exploration of anxiety, the exploration of despair, the exploration of death, right? All of this is part of what it means to be a material, finite being, right? So because the existentialists dare explore the negative aspects, or so-called negative aspects, right, the dark side of our humanity, like despair, death, and so forth, they've been labeled nihilist, right? Because most philosophers, they want to talk about reason and how powerful we are and how, you know, how we have control and mastery over the world. Existentialists are saying we have no control, we're gonna die. But let's explore that, right? So does that answer your question a little bit, Dali? How unjust, do you see how unjust the accusation of nihilism can be?
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay, so that's been the misconception, right? Whereas existentialists don't just explore death and, you know, anxiety and so forth. They also explore life, right? They also explore our passions. They explore love. Kierkegaard explores love, right? They explore pleasure. So we have really, they're exploring everything that has to do with our bodies, right? The body is the one suffering anxiety and undergoing, you know, death and having pleasure and experiencing love, not the reason, right? So that's why. But they are much more. Their writings cover a much broader spectrum than we give them credit for, right? We say, they just talk about death all day. No, they talk about all of life. But yes, they also talk about death. Yes, they have the nerve and the audacity, right, to talk about anxiety, despair, and death, right? Okay. So that's where we are, right? We are switching. Now we're going back in the cave, actually, with the existentialists. The existentialists say, why are we always trying to leave behind, right, our humanity? Let's go back. Let's explore that. And let's see if we can find meaning, beauty, transcendence right where we are. And that's another feature of existentialism, right? So there's two features, right? Number one, existentialism says, let's go back to the cave. That's number one feature. Let's go back to the body, the materiality, what makes us human. Second thing they say, let's see if we can find within the cave, within our materiality, within our bodies, this meaning and this transcendence that we are trying to find by escaping. So they really believe that when we go deep enough in the explorations of what it means to be human, you'll hit upon a dimension of transcendence, right? So I wish I could do you my drawing. Maybe I can actually, it'll work. Let me give you my drawing that I do on the board usually to distinguish existentialism from Platonism. Okay, can you see? No, it's not very clear on the screen. Let me make it bigger. Okay. It looks like 80, right? Okay. Let me make sure everybody sees this. Return on gallery view. Everybody sees my picture? Okay, now I'm going to explain it. All right, this one, right? This is Plato, the material and the ideal, right? So you have to leave behind the material to reach the ideal. The existentialists have a different view. This is the material, and within the material, boom, you have transcendence, meaning the deeper dimension of life. Okay, everybody got this? Put your hand, should I re-explain it? Okay, so that's in essence, right, the difference. Whereas Plato, right, he has the infinite, right? So matter, you have to leave behind to find the ideal. For the existentialist, you have the material, and within the material, you have a core that brings us to transcendence, the absolute, and the deeper dimension of life, right? So for the existentialist, it's not by escaping our lives or escaping the cave that we find this glorious dimension. It's by living. The more we live, the more we suffer, the more we love, the more we find pleasure, the closer you come to this dimension. Now, this dimension of transcendence has several names. Heidegger, some of them call it being, right? Some of them call this dimension mystery. Kierkegaard will call it eternity, right? So these are just, and then some people just call it love, right? So you know how in Christianity they say that, you know, God is outside, also Judaism and Islam, right? God, this dimension is outside of us, right? We need to fast, and we saw this with Rumi, right? We need to fast and leave our bodies so we can access God, right? The existentialists are saying this whole dimension of God is found in life. And it's by living, by connecting with each other that we find God, right? So this is very interesting shift, right? That we have here. So that's where we are with Kierkegaard. Now, remember this drawing I gave you of the two circles, the circle outside and the circle within, right? The material, and then within you have the spiritual, or the what Kierkegaard calls eternity and so forth. This is very important because we're going to see that for Kierkegaard, one of the keys to creating a successful relationship will have to do with connecting with this dimension, right? In other words, as long as you're strictly living in the material realm, your relationship is going to be sometimes good, sometimes bad, sometimes good, sometimes bad, and sometimes too horrible to continue, right? So you're kind of like going back and forth, tossed back and forth, right, by what's going on. But, says Kierkegaard, if you can connect to this core, you become consistent. And as such, you also become powerful. You have, if you become consistent, if you become grounded in that core, right, you can actually develop the consistency, and as such you have a transformative, you have the ability to transform your relationship. So we'll talk more about that, right, when we talk about the Kierkegaard's notion of the source of love, right? But for now, right, let's just remember this, right, this idea. Now, by the way, this idea that there is at the core of life a dimension which is mysterious, which is love, which is, you know, divine, is not new, right? The existentialists didn't invent this. You have this in several world religions. You have this in Hinduism. You have this in Taoism. You have this in Stoicism. You have this in Greek thought, and I'm going to go over each one. And you have it, of course, also even in Christianity, right? So let me just go over, right, some of these traditions so you can begin to visualize better what Kierkegaard will be talking about, right? So you can visualize it, and it will be easier for you then to understand what Kierkegaard is saying. So anybody who in the class is familiar with Hinduism, and can you tell me what is this dimension called and where is it found? Where is the divine found according to Hinduism? Anybody know? Is it in the sky somewhere beyond the galaxies like you have in Islam and Judaism? Anybody know? Hinduism, where do you find God? Where is God in Hinduism?
Isn't God everywhere for Hinduism? Like you can find God within yourself, within anything and everything?
Yes, the key to what you said is within, right? In Hinduism, God is within. Within me, within every being in the universe, right? God is inside, not outside. Whereas when you talk about Christianity, Judaism, Islam, God is outside, right? So here you have the idea in Hinduism that the divine is actually within. And if I dig deep enough, I'm going to find it, right? And how do you connect to it according to Hinduism? Anybody remember? What do you have to do to connect to the divine within? What's the practice you should be doing? Anybody know? What do they do, these Hindus? What is the main contribution of Hinduism to the world?
I don't know if this is Buddhism or Hinduism, but there's something about like getting rid of all your desire. I'm not sure if that's...
Exactly, right. You have to learn to meditate. You clear your mind, you clear yourself of the clutter, and then you can begin to actually access this deeper dimension, right? So meditation is the tool, right, that they use to declutter your mind, declutter your emotions. And once you're perfectly still, boom, you connect, right? So you can see how it's within, right? This is not, so you have similar, right, to what I'm saying here with existentialism. You can actually find the divine or transcendence or the mysterious realm, right, of transcendence within, right? Now, same thing with Taoism. You have life, and then you have what they call the Tao, right? And the Tao is this kind of intelligence of life, right? It's this kind of deeper intelligence that we need. It's the deeper, so let me summarize it for some. Tao would be the deeper intelligence of nature, right? So for the Taoists, nature is not random. There's a deeper intelligence of nature to which we need to try to connect, right? Now, does anybody know how in Taoism, in Chinese worldview, we connect to the Tao, to this deeper dimension, which is not God for them because they're secular, right? But it's a dimension of mystery, dimension of transcendence. So Dali, yes, meditation, but more than that, they do something extra. If you go early in the park in Flushing, you will see what Tai Chi, exactly. Tai Chi, Qigong, these movements, right? These are movements, they're not just random movements like stretches, like we do that. We do push-ups, sit-ups, and stretches. No, these are movements which are actually kind of like a dance whereby you bring yourself in tune with this dimension, with this intelligence of nature, right? So again, same idea that within nature, there is something transcendent, mysterious, divine, right? And then you have, of course, the Stoics, which say pretty much the same thing. They say there is an intelligence, same idea as Taoism, intelligence of nature. Greek thought talks about also the intelligence, or in Greek, nous, which is within the universe, right? So this is the idea of which a lot of us believe, right, that nothing is random. There's an intelligence kind of guiding the universe, how it's made up, right? And then you even have Christianity talks about this. Now, Christianity is kind of like Judaism and Islam. God is outside, but where else is God, according to Christianity? Where else can you find God apart from on his throne in the heavens? In the heart. Very good, right? When Jesus says, right, the kingdom of God is within you, he's saying something very Eastern, right? And also obviously universal, right? So this is like when this saying, right, the kingdom of God is within you, he's saying something very powerful, right? Something that the existentialists are talking about, right? So when you know these traditions, right, existentialism doesn't feel so foreign anymore, and certainly doesn't feel nihilistic anymore, right? Since you have in existentialism a celebration of what is, as containing a core, a spiritual core, right? So the existentialists, in a way, love life instead of hate it, right? So to say they're a nihilist is in fact crazy, right? Because the existentialists, by saying that within life there is the divine, they're saying life should be celebrated, the body should be celebrated, the cave should be celebrated, the instincts, the materiality. All of this contains this core, right? That we need to learn to connect to if we are going to live our lives artfully, right? All of these traditions, Hinduism, Taoism, Stoicism, Christianity, all talk about the need to connect to this source. And Kierkegaard is going to use the word source, literally, right? So an inner source, right? Which is from which we can gather, right, nourishment, strength, stability, and anchor, right? And then you live your life differently, right? So I hope I made this clear, because we're going to come back to this idea of the source and this idea of connecting to something within when we get to a difficult section on the crisis in love, right? When things are not going well, how do you cope? And Kierkegaard is going to be mentioning this, okay? So I'm preparing it. All right. Okay, is this clear? Any questions on this section? This is the most important conceptual section.
Yeah, I had a question. Can you please repeat Stoicism, what they believe?
Yeah, so Stoicism basically says the same thing as Taoism. They say there is an intelligence of nature, right? Except the Stoics are more saying that this intelligence of nature is aware of you and is aligning your life for you, right? So according to the Stoics, wherever you're put in life, it's nature put you there, and don't try to escape, dwell in it and see why you're there, right? So it's beautiful philosophy, especially when you're stuck in life, right? As soon as you get stuck in life, we try to escape. The Stoics would say, well, nature put you there. The intelligence of life put you there. And so there's a reason why you are in this mess, right? Now try to explore and investigate why you're here and what you need to learn. It's very profound philosophy, actually, right? Stoicism. So same idea, right? There's an intelligence which is orchestrating things within life, not some God out there, arranging things for you. It's here, right? Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Yes. Any other questions before I get to the biography?
Yes, Professor, I have a question. So you said something about nous. What culture did you say it belongs to, or what religion?
So that's Greek. Nous in Greek means intelligence. So that's a Greek word, right? Nous. From the word, I wonder if knowledge, our word knowledge comes from that. It could, possible. that there is a connection between our Latinized word, but I'm not sure.
Okay, thanks.
Mhm. Okay, anything else? We're good? All right, biography. So the dates, 1813 to 1855. We're not going too far away from Kant, since Kant was in Germany and Kierkegaard is in Denmark. So we're just moving north. But we're moving in time. And this is important, right? Because Kant is living in modernity and Kierkegaard is beginning the pioneering work of existentialism. So it's a very different approach, opposite actually approach. So he was born in Denmark, in Copenhagen. So just a few words on his family because it affected actually him emotionally and then eventually philosophically. So kind of if we want to do the gossip on Kierkegaard, so his family was kind of the story of the town. The father of Kierkegaard was actually well known, very prominent man in the society, in high society. And he was married, had children, everything was good, until the father, right, falls in love with a maid and has child with her, and that's Kierkegaard. And so the father divorces his wife, which at the time is unheard of. First mistake, right? And second mistake, marries the maid, who is of much lower social status, right? And people are like, what what are you doing, right? And so in a way, the father kind of fell from grace, right? In the eyes of everyone. And so the father never quite recovered from not only falling from grace, but the depression and the guilt, right? The Christian guilt, right? Denmark is very Christian, and this kind of thing, like where you divorce your wife, commit adultery, then it's finished for you, right? So he suffers not only from losing his his kind of reputation, but he also suffers a lot from guilt from having done this, right? So he has a few more children with the maid once they're married, and Kierkegaard is one of them, right? So you have this kind of background, right? Kind of similar dark background that we saw with Solomon, right? So this always makes interesting kids, right? Never feel bad about your crazy background. You're probably very interesting now. So you have, right, this background. And so the father is suffering from depression, anxiety, passes it down to Kierkegaard. So Kierkegaard himself is going to be suffering from a lot of, not mental illness, but issues, right? Emotional problems like depression, anxiety, right? And so forth. So he's struggling a lot with that inner, and in fact, Kierkegaard wrote a couple books on depression and anxiety, right? If you go and look, you can find the work called Sickness Unto Death. It's a great title. And the other one is The Concept of Anxiety. So if you're struggling, right, with anxiety, with this, these are great books because it's coming from someone who himself struggled with it. And actually just a few words on how he dealt with his depression and anxiety. Kierkegaard actually always said, this depression that I'm feeling is telling me something about where I am spiritually, right? So Kierkegaard never believed that it was just a chemical thing like we do, right? He always believed that anyone who's suffering from depression or anxiety or any type of, mild mental illness, right? It's a spiritual problem, not just a biochemical problem, right? So it's interesting to see that perspective, especially nowadays. If you suffer from depression, you go to your therapist, they're not going to tell you, oh, you have a spiritual, no. They're going to tell you, here are some drugs, take them and now go and function, right? So we bypass, by numbing ourselves, right? Quickly, immediately with drugs without exploring what's happening, right? Without trying to follow the guidance of our depression, right? Where our depression leads or where it comes from. We are missing, right? A lot of the existential message that the depression is sending us, and we're missing the opportunity to grow in a way, right? Or to discover deeper regions of ourselves. So although Kierkegaard probably would not say, never take medication, he would say, if you take medication, you should still take the time also to explore where the depression is coming from, what the depression is telling you, right? Where are you disconnected, right? So that's just a parenthesis, right? Just on those texts. So So he suffered with that, and so this affected, of course, his relationships. And there's one relationship he was in which really shaped not only him but everything else he wrote, right? And so I'm going to tell you a little bit that story so you can situate him romantically. So Kierkegaard, when he was in his 30s, fell in love with a very young girl called Regina. She was like 15 or 16 at the time. Remember, there were no underage laws in Europe at the time. So he wasn't committing a crime or anything. Anyways, they were not sleeping together. They had to be married first. So he was in love with this girl and she was in love with him. And he chickened out. They were about to be married and he lost it. And he canceled everything. And she, of course, first love, right? She was heartbroken. She hung on. She insisted. She cried. She tried everything. He couldn't do it. Like he couldn't commit, right? He had a very deep problem, right, with this idea of committing. So she eventually is pressured to remarry, right? So a year after the breakup, she's already remarried to this prominent, bureaucrat, and they never end up together, right? So Kierkegaard, in a way, this thing, right, this rupture is going to profoundly mold the man that he becomes and the writer and the thinker that he becomes. Everything that he wrote comes from there, right? You can trace her in everything that he writes. And really the main question that he's struggling with in many of his writings, right? He has three themes: anxiety, God, and love. So in his writings on love, right, you can sense that there's always the same question, which probably was the question which was the obstacle to his being with Regina. It's always the same question: can love last, right? Why should I commit to this woman? And this is a question that a lot of us are struggling with, by the way, right? A lot of us, we don't take the step of commitment or the step of marriage. Why? Because we ask ourselves, well, now I love him or her, but will I love him still in 20 years? What if I change? What if they change? How can I make promises that I can't keep, right? This was his issue. He didn't want to make a promise that he felt he couldn't keep, maybe, right? So this is really the core question that, in a way, possesses Kierkegaard, right? And from which all of his writings will emerge, is really the question: is lasting love possible, right? Can we, is it something that's only in the books or in the novels, or can we actually create that, right? So when he was dealing with Regina, that became a stumbling block. The fact that he wasn't sure that he could love her for a lifetime made it impossible for him to take the step. So much later, he writes about this, and he says, very interesting thing. He says, the reason I didn't marry Regina was that I didn't have enough faith, right? So he kind of situates the problem spiritually for himself. But in general, right, throughout his life and his writings, he will struggle with love, with his insecurities, with the fact that he is not sure he can succeed, that he can create this lasting love, right? And many people, if they're not sure they can succeed, they don't take the step, right? And this is the problem nowadays. So that's really the issue. So we'll see now I'm just going to go over 3 of his works, and we'll see his progression, right? He begins exploring this issue early with the Journal of the Seducer, then he matures a bit and writes Either Or, and Works of Love is the highest, right? It's the culmination. This is when he finds his answer, right? But in the first 2 books, he's exploring. So let's go over those 2 books. Any questions so far before I go on into the 3 books? Okay. All right, first book, if you're a guy, you're gonna love this. The Journal of the Seducer. So this is really, it's a very cynical book, right? That he writes right after the breakup. And some people speculate, or I think he said it, that he wrote this book so that Regina would stop loving him. So he depicts in this book basically a player. And it's basically the player's manual. So if you're a guy, I gave you already some terrible advice to go see The Art of Seduction, right? The book. Now here's another one, bad advice, The Journal of the Seducer. If you're a guy, it's wonderful because this book outlines the female psychology. And so once you understand how the woman reacts, you can know how to manipulate her into falling in love with you. Yeah, this is the whole book. Whole book is about this man who wants to get this girl to fall. He doesn't give a damn about the girl, but he wants to play. This is a game he's playing where he's trying to seduce her and get her to fall in love with him. And once she's finally in love, game over, he dumps her and he leaves. That's the story, right? But so it's very, as a woman, it's hard to read, right? But it's fascinating how deeply aware Kierkegaard is of female psychology, of what gets us, right? So it's a very good book if you want to know more about the female psychology, how to draw a woman in, right? This is excellent. So very early work. So he's exploring there, but in a kind of cynical way, right? The book is very cynical. Okay, so then after this book, oh yes, Hakimian, you have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, I have two questions. So firstly, was his relationship with Regina his first real love or not?
Yeah, I'm assuming it was. I mean, maybe not his first relationship, but he doesn't mention anybody else ever.
So what makes him such a expert on female psychology if he's only had one big relationship?
So Kierkegaard didn't have just one relationship, right? He had one love. So, do you see the difference?
Yeah.
Okay. So certainly Kierkegaard didn't have just that one love, right? Because Kierkegaard is a mixture. He's on the one hand, he's very worldly. On the other hand, he's very, very spiritual. He's both, right? So he had a very worldly side, and I'm assuming that he had several relationships before her. He was 30, right? In his 30s when he met her. But she seems to really have had an impact on him because he never recovers, right, from that particular relationship. So yeah, he's quite well-versed, I think, when it comes to love. But where he's not well-versed and where he gets really through inspiration, I think, the key is the notion of making love last, right? And this is what he's exploring philosophically. And I believe Works of Love is really where he finds the key, right? So maybe not through experience, but certainly through inspiration, there is something profound, very profound in that book that's happening, right? So, and we'll talk about it in a second. Any other questions before I go on?
No, that's it. Thanks.
Okay. All right, the next book, Either Or, is very interesting. So this is now, he's evolved a bit. This is now a dialogue between, okay, so the equivalent would be, let's imagine a Republican kind of conservative man who's married, right? So, conservative family values, right? And then same guy, the player. And so the player meets the Republican or the conservative, right? Married man. And they meet in a bar. And the whole book is their dialogue, right? So now they're talking about love, right? So the player goes to the married guy and he's like, man, I pity you. Every day, the same old stuff, right? Every day, same old woman, right? Nothing different, always the same person. In fact, getting worse, older and older, right? And he's like, man, if you only knew my life, how wonderful and exciting it is. Every night I have another woman. Last night was a Latina. Tonight is going to be Chinese. The night before was a Japanese. And I had so much fun. And man, I pity you, always with the same old person, right? Married man looks and he says, yeah, you have a point. I do envy you sometimes, right? But he says, there's something that I am getting that you will never get. And yes, I don't have quantity, but I have quality. Right? I don't have surface, but I have depth, right? So in other words, you have variety, but I have depth, right? Let me write that word because some of you don't understand and you'll think I'm saying depth. Depth, deepness, okay? So in other words, with one woman, I can go very deep and I can explore layers of her being that you can't just have in one night, right? In one night, you get the surface. You don't get the deep elements of her being, right? And so whereas you have variety, yes, and I do envy you sometimes, I have this dimension of depth. I have the deep. I can go much more deep with that woman and go deeper into her being than you will ever experience, right? As the player that you are, right? So book is interesting because Kierkegaard never makes a moral judgment. He never says, you should get married or you should, play around. He's saying, here are the two paths. And it's really up to the reader to listen to both arguments, which Kierkegaard lays out objectively and very in a balanced way, right? And it's really up to us to decide based on what Kierkegaard has laid out, right? What we want to do. So that's a very different way of doing ethics, right? I mean, we had the Christian morality, which told us what to do. Then we had Kant, which said, well, you know what to do deep down, right? And Kierkegaard, in a way, is saying, kind of similar to Kant, saying, yeah, you decide, right? I'm not going to decide for you. Here are the arguments. Now you take the step you want. So Kierkegaard, very amoral in a way, right? Ziegel, go ahead.
Sorry, which book are you talking about now?
Either
What's
or.
the name of it? Okay,
Either or.
thank you.
Yes. Okay, so that one, right, he's already showing, you can sense his own struggle, right? He's hesitating, should I continue my worldly pursuits, right? Or should I settle down? He is himself the two characters, right? He is oscillating between staying as a player or becoming more settled, and he's not sure, right? Either or, that's why it stays hanging. Now, works of love, which we're going to study, this is the culmination of a very long journey, right? Where he's constantly seeking and trying to figure it out and not really reaching a conclusion, right? When you read Journal of a Seducer, either or, you stay hanging. There's no direction. There's just questions, right? Now, when you get to works of love, you are coming face to face with what I think is a masterpiece, right? This is a book where everything comes together for Kierkegaard. This is a book which has a profoundly powerful spiritual dimension, right? This is where you really see that he has had a breakthrough, right? So Works of Love is really the book that he writes in a state of breakthrough, right? He finally gets it, a little late, but he gets it, right? So let me say a few words about Works of Love, right? Works of Love is really taking its inspiration from the Gospels, right? Remember the Gospels, this is the life and teachings of Jesus. Right, it's a Christian Bible. So now what's interesting about Kierkegaard is that he's not interested in Jesus as, God and dying for us and, atoning for our sins, all the theology, right? He's not interested in that. He's fascinated, however, with the teachings and the life of Jesus and the way that they center in a very consistent way on love, right? Jesus, when he opens his mouth, there's only love, right? When he's teaching, he's not teaching theology, he's not even so much teaching about God, he's teaching how to love, right? So if you really read the Gospels with that perspective, you will begin to notice, right, that this is really what's going on, right? Jesus is not interested in founding a new religion. He's Jewish. There's no indication that he's trying to break off or do something new, but he's really mostly interested in teaching us how to love, right? And not only in his teachings, but in his behavior, he also embodies what it means to love, right? And Kierkegaard is really setting aside all the religious stuff and all of the, Jesus, God dying for our sins. He's not interested in that. He is fascinated, mesmerized by the teaching on love that is coming out of not only the mouth of Jesus, but his whole being, right? So he becomes really mesmerized, and the whole book Works of Love is a commentary. It's an elaboration of what he found in the Gospels with regards to how to love. So for Kierkegaard, really what happened is he had questions, struggling, couldn't find an answer, was suspended in the air, and then he stumbles on the Gospels, right? And there he finds the key, the missing piece of the puzzle that he was looking for in the teachings of Jesus. He finds the secret of creating lasting love. So this is what we're going to find, right? And then of course, having discovered that secret, he writes a whole book, right? Which is really an ornamentation of that secret. It's a kind of a symphony, which he composes around the theme of what he has found in the Gospels, right? So it's a very powerful book, maybe because it has its roots in a spiritual tradition, right? But the book itself is not trying to be Christian, it's not trying to convert people to Christianity. It's an exploration of the teachings of Jesus on love, right? Okay, so that's the first thing, right? So we should expect, so when we read the book, the two texts I've given you to read, I'm hoping you're going to find, right, that key that he found, and that will help all of us, right, craft, right, create these lasting relationships. Okay, so just a couple words on some terminology in the book which might be annoying. There's two, he has two again, like Kant, like Plato, there are two kinds of love, right? And he's gonna call it poetic love and Christian love, right? So let me stop on those two concepts really quick. So poetic love, when he talks about the poet, right? And you might be thinking, well, you're gonna start thinking about Rumi and you're gonna be angry at Kierkegaard, right? So Kierkegaard, when he talks about the poet, he's not talking about someone like Rumi, right? He's talking about popular culture, pop songs, okay? When he's talking about the poet, he's talking about popular culture, pop songs on love. Now, all of us know these pop songs, right? Talk about love. And they offer us a very, I mean, sadly, I wish I could find a pop song that's intelligent, occasionally, right? But in general, right, the pop songs are very much on the surface. It's about the first, spark of love. Forget about lasting love. The only pop songs, I always joke about this, the only pop songs about lasting love are the pop songs coming from India. If any of you listen to Indian popular pop songs, right? Bollywood movies, and so they will be celebrating. The music video will feature a married woman and a married man, married together with a child. I've never seen this, right? In like American music videos. So there's not really a depiction in our popular culture of what lasting love looks like. We only have the first infatuation. This is what we sing about, infatuation, right? So you have to go to India to get something a little deeper. So that's the thing, right? So when Kierkegaard is talking about the poet and poetic love, he's talking about that very superficial kind of a rendition or a celebration of infatuation, puppy love, young love, right? And so he's saying, so he's bashing that, right? He's saying we need to move beyond that. There is more, right? And so now he will talk in distinction with that, in contrast with the poet, he will talk about Christian love. Now, when he talks about Christian love, I want you to listen carefully. He's not saying you have to be a Christian to experience that kind of love, right? When he says Christian love, he's talking about Christ-like love, right? So anytime you see the word Christian love, what he means is Christ-like love, right? To love like Christ, which is really available to anyone, right? Anyone, whether you're a Muslim, a Jew, or Hindu, you can read the Gospels and be like, oh, yeah, I want to love like that, right? I like the way this man loves. I'm going to follow in his footsteps. So Christian love means Christ-like love, means the type of love that Jesus or the Christ embodied and taught, right? So this is really not only that when he says Christian love, he's not saying, make sure you get this, because some of you always come up with this objection in your reading assignments, right? So you say, do I have to be a Christian to experience this? No, right? You don't have to be a Christian to experience Christian love. And you can be a Christian and never have an inkling of what Christian love is, right? So it has nothing to do with your religious background. Christian love simply means to love like Jesus, right? When Kierkegaard is talking about it. Okay, good. Any questions before we conclude? Are you still there? Yes, okay. Sometimes I have like I don't know, feeling like I'm by myself. All right, good. So let's stop the recording and talk briefly about your test.